We're live right now.
Well, Otto's the one who said good morning. Good morning, live.
Hi, this is Otto Penzler. I'm at the Mysterious Bookshop in Manhattan with our weekly show about books and authors and collecting. I've used some very important writers in the past. I've talked about major figures like Ross MacDonald, Donald Westlake, Otto Penzler, Robert B. Parker. But today, of course, we're going to the source, the single most important person in the history of mystery fiction, because he popularized it. Edgar Allan Poe invented it, but it's Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle who made this the most popular literary genre in the world for the last 150 years. Now, I have to say that collecting Sherlock Holmes is very, very difficult. It really requires serious money. I'll give you an example. The very first book, the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes anywhere, was in Beaton's Christmas Annual. It was, of course, a study in scarlet, and this is a beautiful copy, as you can see, and the price is $175,000. Okay, kidding. It's actually a facsimile that was published by the Baker Street Irregulars, who put all of their books in these red dust jackets or red covers to show you that. And even this is very collective because so few people can afford a Beaton's, and there are so few to be found. And it's $275 in perfect copy, as you see. Now, Holmes became well-known and well-liked immediately with Study in Scarlet, and then followed up a couple of years later, 3 years later, with A Sign of Four. And I'm going to show you, this is not a very attractive copy. I always talk about condition being so important, but this is a copy of both, sorry, I'm just opening to the title page to show it to you. This is a copy of The Sign of Four, and it's the first authorized edition. Now, one of the things that happened, 1893, and it's, even though it's a shabby copy, it's still not inexpensive. It's $150 because it's really quite rare. One of the things that happened was the popularity of the Holmes character became so enormous when Conan Doyle invented the concept of having a series character, but ongoing in individual stories. Magazines of that era, the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, commonly took novels and ran them serially. But if you missed chapter 17, you were at sea. You didn't know what to do. So Conan Doyle had the idea, well, let's use the same character in every story, but make the story complete. And that's when his fame boomed. There was the Strand Magazine, where he began the adventures of Sherlock Holmes and the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. I don't have any individual volumes. They do exist. They're quite expensive, quite rare, as you can imagine. Magazines of 120, 130 years of age that were avidly read at the time rarely show up in decent condition. But what the Strand did very cleverly, they bound them in 6 monthly parts. So they look like this. These are not rare, but they're not thick on the ground either. And this is how most people would collect nowadays would collect the Strand Magazine. This does not have a Sherlock Holmes story in it. It has a Conan Doyle story in it. But I'm just showing you the cover. This is what they looked like for years. They had a similar binding for many years. But other people preferred to have theirs rebound. And here you see a copy with leather spine and cloth spines. This one has 5 stories from the return of Sherlock Holmes collected in it, and it's $125. It's a little bit less desirable than the original binding, but they look really good on the shelf, and they are the true first appearances of the Sherlock Holmes stories. So it was the adventures of Sherlock Holmes that made him a worldwide figure. And then the second volume of short stories was the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Here's a copy of the first American edition. And this is a surprisingly rare book. It's rarer than the British edition, which had a much bigger print run. And the interesting thing about this was that there was a story called The Adventure of the Cardboard Box that was immediately castigated by many people because it was overly violent, and which is not what you would expect from Sherlock Holmes, but it was about a box showing up with an ear in it. And in retrospect, people have said this is the closest thing that Conan Doyle ever wrote to addressing the Jack the Ripper murders, because Jack the Ripper also sent body parts. That story then was dropped from the first edition immediately by Harper in America, and but this is the first state with the story in it, and it's a really nice copy. It's $1,000. Obviously, at the end of the Memoirs, Conan Doyle killed Sherlock Holmes. Everybody, if you're a Sherlockian at all, you know this. He and Moriarty battled at the edge of the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, and they both went over the side, killing Sherlock Holmes as well as killing Moriarty. Conan Doyle did this deliberately because he was tired of Sherlock Holmes, and he was upset that what he regarded as his more major work, his much more important work, was his historical novels, which many people like, but not too many people read Rodney Stone or The Adventures of Gerard or The White Company these days compared to the number who read Sherlock Holmes. So when this happened in 1894, when Conan Doyle, there were riots in the street, people wearing black armbands, writing threatening letters and insulting letters to Conan Doyle. And he finally had to bring him back in The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1902. And that story was set in the past, before, obviously, Conan Doyle, before Sherlock Holmes went over the edge of the Reichenbach Falls. And the popularity of that appearing serially in the Strand Magazine was so great that lines would wait at the kiosks where the magazine was sold that went down for as far as the eye could see. That the success of The Hound convinced Conan Doyle to again start writing more Sherlock Holmes stories, and he did. I showed you the Strand where 5 stories for the return of Sherlock Holmes appeared, and here's the first British edition, the first edition of the return of Sherlock Holmes. It's a very good copy. It's not a perfect copy. You can see there's some wear on the spine. This is from 1905, and this is $1,000. The American edition looked like this, only it was black. The cloth was black. This is green. It's the first Canadian edition, which came out using the sheets of the American edition. And they came out pretty much simultaneously, fairly scarce also. But by the time we get to the return of Sherlock Holmes and The Hound, the books become a little bit more easy to find. Not easy, more easy, easier, because the print runs were so much bigger because of the huge popularity of Sherlock Holmes. So this Canadian edition, sort of a very good copy, again, rubbed a little on the spine, is $300. The Valley of Fear was the fourth and last novel of the 4 that Conan Doyle wrote. And again, This is the first Canadian edition, and it used the sheets of the American edition. All the pages are the same except for the title page. It's a pretty decent copy. Again, very good, not fine, and it's 200. And then this poor thing. This is the last Sherlock Holmes book, the ninth and final book. It's the case book of Sherlock Holmes, and you can see it's not a very good copy. Conan Doyle first editions are very expensive normally. This one is $35. Condition. But it is a way of having a book, a first edition, at a very reasonable price. Little less reasonable, but fabulous, is the collected editions, 25 volumes, what is known as the Crowberry Edition. There's the spine, and they're bound in similar format, obviously, as a set. This is the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. This is the first volume, and it is for, which book is it? It's Rodney Stone, but it's one of 716 copies numbered and signed by Conan Doyle. Getting any book signed by Conan Doyle, less true for his books on spiritualism, but anything that's connected to Holmes, as obviously all of the stories and novels were collected in this series, is very, very difficult and very desirable for anybody who collects literature, not just mystery fiction, not just Sherlock Holmes. This is $4,500 for the set. I mentioned a little bit earlier about the enormous success and popularity of Sherlock Holmes when the Adventures and the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes came out. And one of the things that happened was that publishers, especially in the United States, but in other places too, pirated the books. And here are a few examples of A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of the Four, because there was no Berne Convention yet that protected copyright. So anybody could publish those books without paying the author royalties. And so they were done in all these various bindings, very attractive. Here, you can see them in so many different formats. These are the only Sherlock Holmes to appear in pirated editions in America are Study in Scarlet and Sign of the Four, but some of his historical novels also appeared. This is Micah Clarke. And these tend to be priced around $25 to $50, depending on the condition. There's an entire book about Sherlock Holmes piracies, which is fascinating. It's a great study about the history of publishing and so on. But that book is focused entirely on Sherlock Holmes parodies and pastiches, piracies. I'm sorry. That slipped out because the next thing and the last thing I'm going to talk about is, so when there are a lot of people who collect Sherlock Holmes. More people now collect Sherlock Holmes than collect Shakespeare or collect Dickens. But what they mostly mean is they collect books about Sherlock Holmes by other people, not first editions of the canon, because most people can't afford it. So they will buy things like pastiches written by other writers. And I brought a few here. These are my favorites, so I'm bringing them. These are the ones I'm showing. John Gardner, who became famous as an espionage writer, and then of course wrote a lot of James Bond pastiches, more pastiches than Ian Fleming wrote, more novels than Fleming wrote. But he wrote 2 novels, and then I got to these were published by Putnam. These are the first American editions, and they're $30 and $20. And this is a little more expensive because the condition's a little bit better. This is $20 because there's a little wear on the jacket on the spine. And then years later, 25 years later, I talked him into writing the third volume of book and titled Moriarty. Here's Lindsay Fay, who has written 3 Sherlock Holmes books, a full-length novel, and this short story collection, and then a second short story collection called Observations by Gaslight, which is coming out in December. Inevitably, of course, self-promotion is relentless on my part. This is a collection of about 70 Sherlock Holmes parodies and pastiches. And then also what is heavily collected in the Sherlock Holmes world are studies. And the studies are basically treating Holmes as a living character, as they should. There are people who think he's a fictional character, but many of us know that, in fact, he was born in 1856, and you've never read his obituary, so he's still alive. And here's from one of the great Sherlockians, S.C. Roberts, from the 1850s, Gavin Brend, and the great Vincent Starrett. And the 221B by Starrett is $100. This is a second printing. It's identical to the first, but it's a second, so it's $15. And Holmes and Watson by S.C. Roberts, first edition, $45. So this is a broad range of what people collect when they collect Sherlock Holmes. Thank you for watching.